I didn't mention anything that I was thankful for because I figured I had 30 minutes to do that. But I got to hear what you all are thankful for, and it's been a blessing. So we'll be in John chapter 10. One thing I'm really thankful for, more than really thankful for, I thank God for, is this church. I spent 2 years at Bible college and then the summer traveling with Neighborhood Bible Time. And after that, I had a lot of doors available to me. I didn't know if they were open or not, but I had a lot of doorknobs available for me to turn and see. And I really didn't know what I needed or what God wanted me to do. And this, staying in the area and joining this church, really wasn't one of those doorknobs that I really thought was available for me to, that God wanted me to do. And but then one day I was in my car, and Lord just really spoke to me, and He's like, "Why don't you just stay here? Why don't you just stay in the area and join this church and help out here?" And that was exactly what I needed. 2 years of Bible college is pretty rough. Charlie Neighborhood Bible Time takes a lot of energy out of you, and there's been a lot of drama and all kinds of stuff the last 2-3 years in the church scene. And this has been really refreshing just being here, and it's exactly what I needed. And God, knows, He gives good gifts to His children, and knows exactly what I needed. And I thank God for this church, for all of you. So last time we looked at the man born blind in John chapter 9. And actually, I think that'd be a great place to start off where we left off. So why not turn to John chapter 9, which should just be one page over. And we looked at the man born blind, and we saw that Jesus didn't pass him by. Jesus saw the man born blind, and He put clay in his eyes, and He said, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." And the blind man believed Jesus, and he went to that pool, and he received his sight. And after he received his sight, the whole community was in an uproar. They're like, "What's going on?" Because it was the Sabbath day, of course, and they were really mad at the blind man and at Jesus. And they interrogated him. They figured it out, and then finally they just cast the blind man out of the synagogue. In verse 22 of chapter 9, and verse 35, we read that they cast him out of the synagogue, and the blind man, just sitting there, just pondering what's just gone on in his life. He received his sight, and now he's kicked out of the synagogue, and then Jesus comes by to him, and Jesus, verse 41, he says, he speaks 39 to the blind man, "For judgment am I come into this world, that they which see not might see, and that they which see might be made blind." And some of the Pharisees which were near, which were with him, heard these words, and said unto Jesus, "Are we blind also?" And Jesus said unto them, "If ye were blind, ye should have no sin. But now ye say, We see, therefore your sin remaineth." And Jesus is going to go on now in chapter 10, speaking to those Pharisees. Chapter 10 is Jesus just speaking to the Pharisees. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. We're going to look at what Jesus is talking to these Pharisees about in John chapter 10. So let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for your word and this church. Thank you for giving me this privilege, this honor of just speaking for you. Lord, I don't understand how it happened, but I'm here, and I thank you, Lord, for your promise to bless those who hear your word. Help me, Lord, to faithfully communicate what you are saying. In Jesus' name, amen. So Jesus, he's with this blind man, and blind man that just got kicked out of the synagogue, which that's a bigger deal than just not being able to go to church every Sabbath day, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And Jesus, he's rebuking these Pharisees, saying that you are blind. And the Gospel of John isn't the only gospel writer who talks about Jesus calling the religious establishment blind. If you want to turn to Matthew chapter 15, verse 14, you don't have to, but Jesus says, let them alone. We're speaking of the Jews, the Pharisees. Jesus says, let them alone. They be blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. So it's throughout the whole gospel narrative, Jesus calling the religious leaders blind. It's not just here in John. And the big verse that I really want to focus on tonight is John 10:9. John 10:9. I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. John 10:9. So all these verses, John chapter 10, they're right after Jesus talking to the man born blind who just got excommunicated from the synagogue, from the whole religious life. And so everything after that, John 10 is directly in context of that. As we read John chapter 10, think about that. The man just got excommunicated from the whole religious scene. And it's not just the religious scene in Jerusalem at this time, it's the whole social economic scene. It's all about, it's not just it's your friends, it's your families, it's your job, how you make money, where you worship on the Sabbath day and all the holy days. Being excommunicated from the whole religious scene is a really big deal. And so everything Jesus is saying here in John chapter 10 is linked to that event of the man being excommunicated from religious life. So I'll start reading John chapter 10. Verily, verily, I say unto you, Jesus to the Pharisees, verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. And when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. And a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. This parable spake Jesus unto them, but they understood not what things they were which he spake unto them. Then said Jesus unto them again, verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. So the Expositor's Bible Commentary has this to say right here. It says, Jesus has pointed out to the Pharisees that they are affected with a more deplorable blindness than the born blind beggar. That was Jesus just before he spoke these things, where he said, if you were blind, you should have no sin. Now, what I just read, now he proceeds to contrast their harsh treatment of the healed man with his own care of him, and uses this contrast as evidence of the illegitimacy, I can't even read this, illegitimacy of their authority and the legitimacy of his own claim. Yes, that was not speaking in tongues. So that blind man, who now sees, he was brought up to consider the ecclesiastical authorities of Jerusalem as representing the divine voice. So the consensus at the time by all the common people, by all the people in political power, by all the people, everybody in Jerusalem was that the ecclesiastical authorities, the Jews, the scribes, the Pharisees, the high priests, these people, they are the divine voice. It's almost, think of it today as the Pope and the Catholics. What they say is the voice of God. What they decree is what God decrees. And Jesus goes on to expose them for decreeing traditions of men as being what God decrees. That's why he called them out on that. This man, the blind man, would feel that his excommunication cut him off from fellowship with all good men and from the sources of a hopeful and godly life. Therefore, in pity for this poor sheep, Jesus, in pity for this poor sheep, the blind man, and in indignation at those who thus assumed authority, Jesus explicitly declares, I am the door. So the commentary, what it's saying is, Jesus is saying, I am the door to this blind man. Because this blind man, he's thinking, great, I have my sight, but this isn't much better than when I was blind, because I'm rejected by my family. I'm rejected by my friends. I'm rejected. I can't even find a decent job anywhere. I can't worship with anybody on the Sabbath. I'm not allowed to go to any of the holy festivals. I'm not allowed anything. I'm excommunicated, and I'm completely shunned from everything I've known before. And I'm not allowed to enjoy anything now that I have my sight. And he's thinking, great, I'm just going to be with the misfits. I'm going to be with the rebels. There's no way I could ever live a decently good life now that I'm excommunicated from the spiritual, religious scene of my community. And I'm just going to be, I don't know, it's not going to be good. And Jesus, what he's saying here, he says, I am the door. You know, the blind man was thinking the door to a good life was through the Pharisees and the traditions of men and what the religious establishment in Jerusalem decreed. But Jesus is saying to that blind man, no, they're not the door. I am the door. Yes, if you want to live a good, abundant life, you're not going to get it from the religious leaders. That's right. You're going to get it from me. So Jesus personally goes to that blind man and he says these things to him. I am the door. And then Jesus goes on to illustrate the Pharisees as thieves and robbers. So he goes to the blind man. He says, "Hey, I am the door." And then Jesus is going to describe those Pharisees as thieves and robbers. And verse 5, "Verily, verily, I say unto you." Verse 1, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber." Jesus is calling the Pharisees a thief and a robber. Because Jesus here is likening Israel to a sheepfold. So, verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. So, okay, let's look at a sheepfold. So, the sheepfold that Jesus is talking about, sometimes we think a sheepfold is just like a little tiny pen, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet. But actually, a sheepfold, it could be like an acre or more, like 2-3 acres. So, it's a pretty big thing. And a sheepfold had more than one person's flock of sheep at night, because the shepherd would be out with his flock all day, and it's going to come to nighttime, and he wants to go to town to get some dinner and sleep. So he's going to bring the sheep not into the city. He's going to lead them in the sheepfold, which is built outside the city. And all the shepherds would bring their flocks into the sheepfold, and it'd be like a sheep motel. And the sheep would stay there. The shepherds would not stay with the sheep. The sheep would stay, they would pretty much entrust the sheep with a porter, with a man, and who was in charge of the sheep motel kind of thing. And in the morning, each shepherd would come back to the sheepfold and get his sheep out of the sheepfold, And so when Jesus says, so Jesus is trying to contrast here the legitimacy of his influence with people and the illegitimacy of whatever influence and authority the religious leaders have, the scribes, Pharisees, and the Jews here. So Jesus is saying, so he's illustrating this with a picture of a sheepfold, which everybody there knew quite well. So Jesus says, "But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep." So Jesus is saying there's really only two kinds of ways to get sheep out of the sheepfold. Either you have to be a thief or a robber, or you've got to be the actual shepherd of those sheep. If you want those sheep, you either got to be a thief or a robber, or you've got to be the shepherd. So think about stealing sheep. Sheep, Jesus says, he says here, verse 4, "And when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice." So the sheep know the shepherd's voice. So when somebody was going to try and steal sheep, they would try to imitate the shepherd's voice. They would spy in the fields where they couldn't be hid, where he was hid, and he would just listen to the shepherd, how he spoke, how he called the sheep. And then at nighttime or whatever, he would try to sound just like the shepherd so he could get the sheep to follow him, because sheep will just follow the shepherd wherever he goes. And if the thief can imitate the shepherd's voice, he hopes that the sheep will follow him, and then he can steal them, because it's hard to carry 100 sheep in your hands. But that wouldn't work. That doesn't work very often. That didn't work very well, because and it was common knowledge that it's hard to imitate a shepherd's voice, and it's probably not going to work out. That's why he says in verse 5 here, and a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. So sheep aren't going to follow a stranger. And then another way that people would try to steal sheep is they would try to fool the porter, because the porter's the guy standing in the sheepfold, because the sheepfold is just a big walled-in area with only one door. There's only one opening, and that's where the porter would stay. He would stand there, he'd lay down there. This porter would spend all night by the one opening in the sheepfold. So a thief or a robber could try to fool the porter into letting him in and taking and leading some sheep out. But Jesus says here, that the porter really only will open up for the real shepherds, because you're not going to fool the porter either. To him the porter openeth, only to the shepherd of the sheep. The sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and he leadeth them out. So you're not going to fool the sheep, you're not going to fool the porter. The only way to steal sheep from a sheepfold is to climb up some other way. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. And this is all common knowledge to the people that Jesus is speaking to. They wouldn't have to think too hard about it like I'm trying to think about it right now. They just knew. So the only way to steal sheep is to climb up some other way. You're not going to trick the sheep into following you. You're not going to trick the porter into letting you through the door. You're going to have to climb up some other way, get into the sheepfold, and manually have to pick up the sheep and throw them over, or try to scare them and get them to run out and jump over the wall. And you have to force. The only way to get a sheep out of the sheepfold is to force them out of the sheepfold if you're not the shepherd. Thieves and robbers have to influence sheep to get them out of the fold. So Jesus is illustrating here exactly what the Pharisees are doing. Because at this time, the Pharisees, the Jews, the scribes, they're furious at Jesus because people are following him. People are acknowledging him to be Christ. That's how the blind man got excommunicated, because they said in verse 35, verse 22 of chapter 9, that if any man would confess Christ, he shall be put out of the synagogue. And they did this. And so people are confessing Christ, and they're reacting to that. And they're doing everything they can to hold on to their influence. They're doing everything they can to persuade men not to follow Christ. Because later in this gospel, they'll say, you'll see that they'll confess that if we don't do anything, all men will believe that Jesus is the Christ. And then the Romans will come and they'll take away our standing. So they're trying to force their influence on the fold of Israel. And so Jesus is saying to them, you are very upset that people are following me. You're very upset that people are responding to my teachings, people are responding to my miracles, people are confessing me to be the Son of God. It's very upsetting to you Pharisees, and you don't know why. And you can't explain it. And you're trying to fight. You fight what's happening. You're trying to keep people from coming to me. And Jesus is saying that he is the shepherd. That the reason why he has influence is because he's actually doing it, because he is the shepherd. Jesus goes on to say he is the good shepherd in this verse. It's the great good shepherd chapter. And there's so much more to talk about. That's why, but I don't think we'll get that far because there's just too much to talk about. So Jesus is really just saying that the legitimacy in these first couple of verses, 1 through 5, he's just trying to nail home what he's doing is legit. The shepherd can get the sheep out of the sheepfold because he's legit, the shepherd. That's why the sheep hear his voice, and that's why that's why they follow him, because he's legit. The scribes, the Pharisees, they are the thieves and robbers. Their influence with the sheep is not legit because they're climbing up some other way. To get their authority, to get their power, they're not going about it the right way. They're coming up some other way into the sheepfold and trying to get the sheep to do what they want them to do. So Jesus is saying here, he's saying, I'm doing right. When I gain leadership and influence with the people, I am doing nothing wrong. I am going about it in the right way, not like you Pharisees. There is a right way to get your sheep out of the fold, and I'm doing just that. So here we have a picture of the legitimate and illegitimate modes of finding access to men and gaining power over them, says the commentary I mentioned previously. The legitimate leader of men comes by the door and invites. The illegitimate gets in anyhow and compels. The true shepherd is distinguished from the robber by both the action of the porter and the action of the sheep. So, picturing this as Israel, as a parable, at the sheepfold is Israel. The porter, to illustrate this parable, would be seen as John the Baptist, because John the Baptist went before Christ's public ministry and proclaimed that Messiah was coming. It was open. It was not secret. Everyone in Jerusalem knew that the Messiah was coming if they believed the words of John the Baptist. And some would say that the porter, to him the porter openeth. To him the porter openeth. That could also be Jesus' impeccable life and miracles. So really, I think what Jesus is trying to say here is it was in the open. A shepherd doesn't have to secretly try and get his sheep out of the sheepfold. It's all in the open. People see it. People hear it. All the miracles Jesus did, they were out in the open. We read all over the Bible that Jesus is teaching in the temple. He's teaching in the synagogues. He's teaching people and there's mobs of people. The only time that Jesus is alone is when he's praying in private, really. But all his teaching, all his ministry is out in the open and it's public. There's nothing behind closed doors. There's nothing secret. He's not trying to hide anything. And in fact, in John chapter 20, when Jesus is at a trial, at his arrest, those same Pharisees have arrested him. Jesus says, John 18, verse 20, chapter 18, verse 20, Jesus says to those same Pharisees, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret I have said nothing. So Jesus didn't do anything in secret. The influence that Jesus had with the people wasn't something that he did in secret. He wasn't manipulating behind the scenes. He wasn't calling people on the phone, having triangle kinds of conversations with people to try and get them to do certain things. He didn't have a triangle conversation to get Lazarus to raise from the dead. He didn't do these things. Jesus did everything out in the open, and this whatever happened just was done in the open. Wasn't a secret. And you'll notice that the Pharisees do the exact opposite. Throughout Jesus' ministry, the Pharisees, they're in secret, plotting. They're plotting how to kill Jesus. They're plotting how to keep their power by saying in secret, man, if anyone confesses Christ as Messiah, Jesus as Messiah, we're going to kick them out of the synagogue. They're always planning. They're always convening. They're always doing things in secret to try and stop Jesus' ministry. And Jesus is doing nothing like that, nothing of the sort. Everything he does is true and honest and out in the open. At all events, he makes his appeal openly. He has no requisite password. There's no secret password. There is nothing of the thief or of the robber about his approach. Nothing underhand and stealthy. Nothing audaciously violent. Jesus does everything out in the open. The religious establishment conspires in secret to preserve their authority. And so Jesus says, verse 8. First, I'll go one verse ahead. Then said Jesus unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them.
I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. So Jesus says, all that ever came before me are thieves and robbers. And clearly, with the context of this passage, it seems that he's speaking, not so much of the few Old Testament prophets that we have, but he's speaking of the contemporary, right then and now. All the Pharisees and scribes and high priests that are in Jerusalem for the last 300, 200 years in Jerusalem, all that ever came before him are thieves and robbers. They're going about establishing authority over the people in the wrong way. The contemporary authorities in Jerusalem had come before Jesus, insofar as they had prepossessed the minds of the people against him and forcibly kept the sheep from him. Their prior claims were the great obstacle to his being admitted. They held the fold against him. It must have been plain to the people who heard his words, the words of Jesus, that his own ecclesiastical authorities were meant. And this is not contradicted by the added clause, but the sheep did not hear them. For these usurping leaders did not find the ear of the people, although they terrified them into obedience. So this commentary is trying to communicate here is that all that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, and the sheep follow him. All that ever came before me are thieves. I'm so tired, I'm sorry. Where am I? Okay, verse 8. All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. So, honestly, the people, they may have heard the religious leaders, but they didn't really obey, because they were, they terrified them into obedience by threatening to excommunicate them and things like that. But they still had no problem sinning, because we just go back to what kind of started this whole thing, that first day, because this is all one day, chapters 8, 9, and 10, it's all one day. So chapter number 8, the adulterous woman taking adultery, the scribes, the religious establishment weren't able to stop that, and it's thought that happened on the last great day of the feast because, there was such a lack of piety of the common people in Israel that the feasts, the tabernacles, when they would all come together to Jerusalem to dwell in booths, was really just almost like a party time, where you could, kind of just get away with things because you're away from home, and just the loose morals of the day was just so widespread, and so we see, that example of John chapter 8 of the adulterous woman, how, what the work of the scribes and Pharisees really wasn't doing much of anything concerning true righteousness. Right. Yeah. So the blind man was discouraged that he was excommunicated. But Jesus seeks him out and assures him that not the religious establishment, but he alone is the door to spiritual life and well-being. So I want to let's talk a little bit about John and Charles Wesley. So if you don't know John Charles Wesley, if you open up your hymnals, you'll probably find a couple of songs by Charles Wesley and John Wesley in our hymnals. They were great preachers of the... And so John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield, these are three big names in the Great Awakening. These are people from like the 1700s, early 1700s, mid 1700s, later 1700s. So they all went to school in Oxford. That's how they came to know each other. Of course, John and Charles are brothers, and George Whitefield came to school in Oxford, and they were all students together in Oxford. And they were all members of the Church of England. The Church of England was the state church, and so they're all there training for the ministry, studying for the ministry, and they started a club at college called the Holy Club. So that was one of their collegiate clubs was the Holy Club. So they would get together for prayer, devotions, for exhorting one another, and it got to be quite the thing on campus. And eventually, George Whitefield began one one of the members of this holy club, began preaching throughout England, a couple of Church of England churches, pulpits, and he was preaching the grace of God, salvation by grace through faith, and he was calling out the hypocrisy of the Church of England clergymen, and he would say from the pulpit that they weren't saved. He would call out people by name from the pulpit, George Whitefield would, and he would publicly from the pulpit say that the religious establishment, they're not saved. They're not believing by grace through faith. It's some kind of work salvation, what they are believing in. And that would upset people. So eventually George Whitefield got banned from pulpits and he wasn't allowed to preach from the pulpits in England. And because John and Charles were friends with George, they began as well to get some flack. Soon the pulpits were barred from John and Charles Wesley from preaching in Anglican churches because of their association with George Whitefield. And so, but that didn't stop George Whitefield, and that didn't stop John and Charles Wesley. They still began to preach. And eventually, they started a little society within the Anglican Church called the Methodists. It wasn't a denomination. It was just a little society inside the Methodist Church, and the Church of England was okay with it. And this was after John got saved, and Charles got saved. George Whitefield, of course, he was saved before John and Charles were. And so this little society starts growing in popularity. John starts growing in influence. John Wesley, he begins getting quite the following with his band of Methodists, as they were called. And pressure was getting on John because as the years went by, 15, 20 years, John started sending out circuit riding preachers who weren't ordained men from the Church of England. He was actually ordaining men himself, just normal lay people. And this was infuriating the Church of England, and it was also infuriating Charles, his brother. So there started to be a tension between John and Charles. John wanted to continue just serving the Lord Jesus and doing what he wanted to do, and not worried about allegiance to the Anglican Church. But Charles was actually upset with John for baptizing people and for ordaining people to be circuit riding preachers. And actually, John and Charles' relationship, their friendship, would be like severed. They were never really close in those later years of life because of the tension between the Church of England. So I guess what I'm trying to say here, if John Wesley was afraid of being excommunicated from the Anglican Church, if John Wesley was afraid, if George Whitefield was afraid of the displeasure that they had towards the scribes and Pharisees of their day, the world, would have a lot fewer. There'd be a lot fewer Christians in heaven because of it, because their ministry was so impactful. And I think our takeaway is, think of people we're leading to the Lord: Lutherans, even Methodists, Catholics, Mormons, Muslims. For them to really follow the Lord, they're going to be excommunicated from their religious establishment. That's right. And I think for us, when we minister to those kinds of people, is to be mindful that it's a really big commitment for them, because they're going to lose, just like that blind man. He just excommunicated. He lost a lot of things, especially some of these Mormon communities out west, like in Utah and stuff like that. Like the whole town is Mormon, and all your employers are Mormon. And like for you to get excommunicated from the Mormon, church would mean it'd be a hard time for you to get a job in Utah. That's your hometown in some place in Utah, and now you can't get a job anywhere in Utah because you left the Mormon church, and then they all call you. And it's so just think about that. If you're ever dealing with somebody like that, you can take them to this passage, the man born blind, and what Jesus has to say about those Pharisees in this first little part of John chapter 10. And show them that, the Mormon church, that religious establishment, the Catholics, whatever that hierarchy of structure is that men have made, it's not the door to spiritual life, to spiritual well-being. It's only through Jesus. So they don't need to fear, we don't need to fear being excluded from a group to follow Jesus, because Jesus is the door and not them. So while the piano plays, let's think about that. What this blind man suffered, who received his sight, and what Jesus said concerning those Pharisees about him.